The organisations that don't achieve growth, there's a sort of worldview that they are the charity or the non-profit and the donors are just there to give the money. And they just shout at fundraising, try harder, ask them more, and the money will come in. There's no concept of donors as humans. There's no concept that they give to meet an emotional need that 99% of humans have in order to give. And there's no concept, and this is critical, that the charity needs to earn that money by being good at meeting those emotional needs. Both groups of people are absolutely wonderful, but they speak a completely different language, and never the twain shall meet. So after 5 years of trying to teach middle-aged Christian women development language, all they suddenly realised was they just needed to learn their language and the money would come rolling in. Gaining that respect for the fact that donors are human beings and their giving is emotional, and therefore the way we meet their needs must be emotional, that's the absolute heart of the matter.
Hey folks, welcome back to the Fundraising Bright Spots podcast. This is episode 172. I'm Rob Woods, and this is the show for fundraisers who want ideas and maybe a dose of inspiration to help you raise more money and love your job. This time, I was really excited to interview one of the people whose ideas I've found hugely valuable over the last 10 years, ever since I saw him speak at the International Fundraising Congress in Holland. I left that session feeling truly inspired, and I've been a fan of his ideas and his high energy speaking ever since. So when I heard that Alan Clayton had written a book capturing many of the insights he's discovered over the last 10 years, I was determined to see if he'd share some of them with you through the podcast. The book is called Great Fundraising Organisations, and it absolutely lived up to my expectations. I'd recommend it to any charity or not-for-profit that's determined to make a bigger difference and to make fundraising easier and less stressful. And I also really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you like it too. Hello, Alan. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Rob. Thanks very much for having me.
You're very welcome. I got very excited a few weeks ago because I discovered that you'd written a book. And after sitting in your excellent sessions at various conferences over at least 10 years, hearing some of these ideas, I got genuinely really excited to discover that many of them are going to be available in this book. And thank you ever so much for making time after this long slog, I guess, to make the book, to talk to me about it. I guess my first question is, you've worked with lots of different charities in lots of different ways. Why did you write this book, Great Fundraising Organisations?
If you're familiar with the term ikigai, this book is an ikigai moment. The whole Great Fundraising project started out as an accident, and including the time for research and then 10 years of working it. 12 years of examination, research, trial and error, and detail. I came to the conclusion we know how to do this now. And it's essential knowledge that needs to get out there. A particular passion of mine is some of the emerging fundraising markets. Southern America, Southeastern Asia, and Eastern, Western and Southern Africa. I'm down in Southern Africa at the moment. And there's loads of organisations here, that are working with their emerging self-sufficiency and emerging middle classes. And I'm hoping the book will get them to fully professionalised fundraising status without going through the decades of agony that we in the Northern and Western countries had to get through.
Yeah. And you really got my attention very early in the book when you reflected on a brilliant fundraiser you once line managed who sort of got ground down by it all.
Well, my experience of that, which was in my first fundraising management job back in the 90s, defined me. And what's interesting is the whole experience was echoed back in the research 15 years later, that it turns out that the prime responsibility of a fundraising leader is to get the best out of the rest of the organisation on behalf of their fundraisers and of their donors. So that, it's the actual fundraising teams that are raising the money, but 50% of the time of the leader is about getting the best out of the rest of the organisation. And that turns out to be one of the critical behaviours that came out in all the research. Perhaps the greatest at this that I've ever seen is Jane George, currently Director of Fundraising, Marketing and Media at RNLI. Had the privilege of working with them 5 or 6 years ago on a huge repositioning exercise. And at the end of it, the whole team were super fired up. I mean, I've rarely seen energy in a room like that. But when it got to next actions, there was a fear. And Jane said to the room, what's going on here? We were all happily excited half an hour ago. What are we all worried about now? And one of her senior people said, I think what we're all anticipating is the reaction from the rest of the organisation when we get back to pool and we've come up with this incredibly focused, incredibly emotionally powerful positioning. And Jane didn't draw breath. She went, forget about that. That's my problem. I'll deal with that. That's what I get the big bucks for. I'll sort out the rest of the organisation. You guys crack on and raise the money. And so maybe 20 years on from me not knowing that was my job, watching a master at that job do it was an absolute joy. And it took Jane months to get the rest of the organisation fully on board. But she took all the pain of doing that while her team were just moving really fast, bringing the money in.
I guess at the heart of the book is the research that some organisations really do step up and achieve extraordinary, wonderful growth, transformational growth.
Absolutely.
There's lots of things, I guess, but if you were to sum up what's the difference between what's going on in those ones versus many others which are not managing to do that, how would you sum that up?
One word, it's behaviour. The first round of research, the original Great Fundraising Report, is brilliant and it's very detailed, but they behave differently. They don't have different knowledge, they don't have different skills, they don't have different structures, but the behaviour of the people is very, very, very different. Subsequent rounds of research have been getting into a greater level of detail about more and more specific behaviours that are different, but they all cascade down from one or two very, very different prime behaviours that are driven by different beliefs at the leadership level of the Great Fundraising Organisations.
Yeah, and it struck me in the book, you had a story, I think the names were changed, but there was a fundraiser who was calling a donor called Marjorie, who is elderly in Australia. And there was a realisation he got and then his colleagues got from that conversation. And I think in a way that sums up some of how these high-achieving organisations see fundraising differently.
Yeah, absolutely. The organisations that don't achieve growth, there's a sort of worldview that they are the charity or the non-profit and the donors are just there to give the money. And they just shout at fundraising, try harder, ask them more, and the money will come in. There's no concept of donors as humans. There's no concept that they give to meet an emotional need that 99% of humans have in order to give. And there's no concept, and this is critical, that the charity needs to earn that money by being good at meeting those emotional needs. So what you tend to get, the more panicky, fear-driven organisations, they just try to make their fundraising more efficient. I cannot believe, Rob, I've been in fundraising over 30 years and people are still arguing about whether you should say thank you to donors or not. Of course you bloody well should, it's only polite. I mean, forget the efficiency argument. It's just rude not to. But all the evidence is you need to meet the emotional needs. And what that story was about was an organisation that could have made a few more Australian cents, as it was, a year by making Marjorie's gifts more efficient. But what they would have done is taken all the meaning of giving out of Marjorie's life, and she would inevitably have ended up giving to another organisation. So they didn't understand previously that they need to earn the money by meeting Marjorie's needs very well. But of course, after that one call and the subsequent discussions, they have become the very best in Australia at meeting the emotional needs of their donors.
Yeah. And one way of describing that shift is that now those in the organisation understand and are okay that actually there are two things going on here. In the book, you say 2 businesses, 1 mission, not compromise, and we're all trying to do exactly the same thing. Could you share with us what you mean by 2 businesses, 1 mission?
Yeah, so I believe that, well, I don't believe, I can evidence, that there was a kind of decay in fundraising started sometime back in the 1980s. And that is when we started to bring in specialists from the commercial sector to tell us how to do fundraising better. And quite frankly, they made a whole bollocks of the whole thing. Because what they did is they came in and said, you need to do integrated communications and you need to drive everything with your brand. And therefore, you've got to break down all of your silos. My data tells me quite clearly the Great Fundraising Organisations don't do any of those three things. They realise they've got two sets of customers. There are the service users and there are the donors. And one part of their charity, the business of providing services, needs to be the best in the country or the best in market at meeting the needs of the service users. And the other part of the business, fundraising, needs to be the best in market at meeting the emotional needs of the donors. So where you get it, if you try to integrate it into one business, is that you're basically trying to integrate two bits of communication that cannot be integrated. Because one bit of communication is designed to encourage service users to do the service, which is, we're great and you've got nothing at all to worry about. Whereas the message to donors is, we can't help everybody because we don't have enough money, we're not good enough yet. Integrate those two, you're going to end up with something beige, blancmange, or just the same words as every charity uses. You can't integrate them. They're different messages, they're different businesses. One is an academic scale, medical, social work, or development business that has to be absolutely bureaucratically perfect to avoid hurting people, and that's services. And the other one is fundraising, which is a fast-moving sales and marketing-driven business that works entirely in the emotional space. They couldn't be more different. And CEOs and directors of fundraising have driven themselves to mental breakdowns for 40 years trying to make these two businesses into one. Fundraisers have burnt out and left the sector, and all you have to do is recognise that the skill to lead a great fundraising organisation means we need to lead two businesses that are trying to achieve the same mission, and they need to respect each other and work beside each other. But for goodness sake, don't try and turn them into one.
Yeah. In the book, you had a really good example of how this pans out in messaging terms. I've never worked with them, so I might be pronouncing the name of the Irish charity wrongly. Is it Trocaire and the difference this made to communications before and after seeing it this way?
Trocaire, I believe it's the Gaelic word for mercy, which kind of shows its Catholic roots as an organisation. Yeah, this was a good example, but it's symptomatic of something that we see. So when you consider that, the organisation is brilliant and it's got a glitzy brand and it's telling everybody how fantastic it is, the next stage for the organisations that really fail are the ones where the people from the services, they actually think the donors are a bit silly and a bit embarrassing, and they don't really need to have their needs met. What they need to do is be educated or campaigned at. And then you get the situation where people are shouting at people and expecting them to give money. The Trocaire example is great because their donor base are entirely slightly older women with Catholic Christian values, whereas their programme staff are all humanitarian intellectual aid workers. And both groups of people are absolutely wonderful, but they speak a completely different language, and never the twain shall meet. So after 5 years of trying to teach middle-aged Christian women development language, all they suddenly realised was they just needed to learn their language and the money would come rolling in. And in a nutshell, that's what happened. The substantive part of the communications didn't exist. But what it leads to is Colin Skehan, who now works with us, but he was one of the big drivers at Trocaire of their phenomenal growth. He just says that his big truth bomb is fundraising is absolutely at the mercy of the behaviour of the rest of the organisation. If they understand and get on board, then I can have what I need to drive growth. If the rest of the organisation is opposing me, I've got no chance.
Yeah, and it made perfect sense to me when I read that example. I might get the words a bit wrong, but the gist was initially so much of the messaging which suited one half of the organisation was about fighting for justice.
Yeah.
And I think you said in the book, those largely elderly Catholic women don't like fighting. It's the last thing on their mind.
They don't want to fight anybody.
They don't want to fight anybody. And even the word justice, which to many of our listeners will feel like a strong and meaningful word, to them that wasn't in their lexicon either. And I think once the organisation got clear that it's okay for us to fight for justice, but these people, the reason they give, I can't remember the exact wording.
Until love conquers fear.
That's it. And once I saw those two examples, I got basically so many organisations I've ever worked for and with have those two versions in their messaging, and many other differences too, but they're forever trying to find a compromise between the two, or the fundraising organisation is just expected to go out with the one that suits people internally, and of course fundraising is even harder then.
Yeah, those happen in the majority of organisations. I mean, and this affects culture, investment, trust in fundraising, belief in fundraising. But the idea that we in programs are the experts in communications, you just have to take our stuff and sell it to donors. If that's the view in the organisation, you're the fundraiser, fight it. And if you don't win the fight, leave, because you've got no chance. And what it all boils down to, and I do say in the book, I've got a big chapter on this, which is the crux of it all is respect for basic human emotions. So giving is an emotional behaviour, and it's not even a complex emotional behaviour. It's one of the basic ones, and it's highly emotional. There's very little rational about giving whatsoever. And even people who give massive gifts, the rational argument is not should I give or not, it's who's the best organisation to give to. The problem is that in most professions, emotions are seen as being unprofessional. And the more academic or scientific a profession, the more disdain there is for emotion. And most people that work in medical departments or international development departments are highly educated. So they just have a distrust or distaste of or even disdain for emotional behaviour. And they think that the solution to everything in the world is to train everybody so that they all act as rationally and as academically as they do. And the result, of course, if you do that, because nobody gives money rationally and academically, is you might win the argument, but you're going to have no money. And you're not going to be very good at changing the world by winning the argument, but having no money. And this is what we see over and over again. So the big change is that respect and value for those wonderful emotional drivers that make us human. I've got a lot of sympathy for people in those departments who might have spent 3, 5, 7, 10 years learning how to emotionally distance themselves. You know, we work with children's hospices across Scotland. And you know, if you do not have the most amazing emotional control, you cannot work in that organisation. You would be vicariously traumatised every single day. So the amount of training on how to manage your emotions is immense. How do you manage your emotions but stay kind and compassionate? Good grief, that's an amazing profession to be able to do that. But they are trained to suppress their emotions. They become brilliant at it, and then us fundraisers come along and say, could you just pop the emotion back in for half an hour so we could raise some money, please? So I understand why we get a bad reaction, but gaining that respect for the fact that donors are human beings and their giving is emotional, and therefore the way we meet their needs must be emotional, that's the absolute heart of the matter. But of course, there are reams of professional training and cultural attributes that make that a surprisingly difficult thing to achieve.
Hi, it's Rob, and I want to let you know about our 2 flagship courses designed to help you grow high-value fundraising results. That's Major Gifts Mastery and Corporate Partnerships Mastery. The next programs start in May 2025. Space is limited, and both courses are filling up fast. Rather than have me tell you how they work, I thought it would be most useful if you could hear from someone who's done one of the courses. So here's a short clip from Sam Harford at the British Red Cross.
If you want to improve your major donor approaches and raise more money for your charity, I would really recommend Rob's Major Donor Mastery course. It was absolutely fantastic for me and built my confidence so much. And I really began to change my mindset and start focusing on cultivating for major donor relationships rather than major donor gifts. Since joining the programme, I've raised over £600,000 in pledges and donations. So I'm really grateful for all of the support and guidance from Rob.
If you'd like to find out more about these programmes, or our in-house training days, or any of our other training, go to brightspotfundraising.co.uk/services. So this all makes absolute sense, Alan, and some of our listeners are leading the team or the department, and some of them are just very hard-working fundraisers, and officially they're not the leader. But starting with what you've just said and knowing that it is the case, what advice do you have us for as leaders or influencers in an organisation actually helping things to happen differently?
Yeah, okay. Well, if you're working in frontline middle management fundraising, one of the prime skills is managing upwards, leading upwards. We do reference that in some detail. And you need to manage upwards. And if you're the leader, you need to manage upwards as well, because to lead the two businesses with one mission takes an open-minded and determined chief executive, senior leadership team and board. I've got data that shows a common characteristic, which is basically a leadership which is free of ego. It's what Jim Collins describes as level 5 leadership. But if I take different characters, I'm going to pick on the chief exec here because a lot of my recent research has been into that role. We often get chief executives will ask for a one-to-one conversation with me because they don't want to have it in front of their fundraising team, which I fully understand. And there are two types of them. One is the chief executive who's got an ego, and they come on and say, my fundraising team are underperforming. How can I kick their butts and whip them into shape? And I generally listen politely for half an hour, then close those conversations down. And the other one is brilliant. And it's exemplified by Rasmus Kjeldahl, who's the chief executive of Borns v. Kåre, children's rights organisation in Denmark. But by way of context, they have just reached 100,000 monthly givers in a tiny country like Denmark. And they're now the largest public fundraising organisation in Denmark. 7 years ago, they had no monthly givers, and they weren't even in the top 100. So it's quite an achievement. It's a story I can tell at great length. And I can remember my first ever conversation with Rasmus. He attended one of our master classes, and at the first coffee break, he came to me and said, thank you very much, I've realised something. He said, for the last 20 years, I've spent my life in policy and in programs work with children. That's what I do. And I thought I'd made it to the top of the tree by becoming chief executive at Borns v. Kåre. It's the most senior job in this area in Denmark. And I said, and what I've now realised is two things. Is we only reach a small percentage of the children that need our help, and that's not good enough. And then he said, and there's a whole part of this business that I have no experience of, which is how to bring the money in. And he said, thank you for that insight. I'm going to now learn how to do that. You will be teaching that to us in the next few days. Rest assured, Rasmus, we will. And then after 2 days, he actually stopped the seminar and he said, we are all in this room convinced now. Could you take a 10-minute break, then just tell us what to do next? And it was a legendary breakthrough. And Rasmus Kjeldahl had the humility to say, I know all there is to know about children's rights, but I actually know nothing about fundraising, and I can't build a fundraising team until I know what my role is. So he learned it, and then he built his fundraising team around it. And the rest is history. I had a call from a CEO just a week ago, actually, that was proofreading the book with one of us, and she asked me for a call. And she said exactly that. She said, that feeling you had when you lost that amazing fundraiser from your team because you couldn't give him what he needed, she said, that's where I am. She said, I don't know what I need to give my fundraising team. They're enthusiastic, but they don't have what they need. She said, what do I need to give them? It was a brilliant half-hour call. The answer was the board. You need to get the board on board. But that's another part of the book.
And Alan, that's an excellent example. And if our listener is not the chief exec, but they're somewhere within the fundraising team and they're striving without ego to kind of make a bigger difference, what tips do you have for how they do that?
Well, we look at long-term growth, so I can't advise on how you raise more money on the week-by-week basis. There's plenty of your podcasts can give people advice on that. But looking over the long term, what you can do as a frontline or middle management fundraiser is start to learn these leadership skills early and become one of the great leaders as you move through your career, but be different to leaders of the past and be prepared for it when you get there. You know, there was no leadership training of this kind available until now, basically, so make the most of it. And the other thing that can be done is leading upwards. And my big advice on this is to sell, not moan. I'm a chief exec and I've sat there and managed some quite large teams in my life. And boy, do people moan. That's your job as a chief executive. You listen to people and they're going, oh, we don't have this, I can't perform because of that, I can't perform with this, I can't. And you know what you love is if someone comes in to see you and says, if you do this, then this will happen. Yeah, they come in and give you a solution. I think there's a spectacular example of this from an organisation in the United States called Lutheran World Relief. We'd engaged with a number of levels in the fundraising department, and we'd done some very, very good work. And then the next critical thing was to reposition and focus the organisation so it could move really, really fast with its new position and get the money. And I'm not going to say he was a block, but the staff were a bit scared of the chief executive, Daniel Speckard. He was humble enough to say, well, I'm now in charge of fundraising. I'm a politician by background. He was an ambassador to several overseas countries from the US. But he said, no. He said, you fundraisers need to voice up and tell us what you need. And then one of the more junior fundraisers said, well, we know how to raise money. This was someone who worked in the direct mail department. And he said, but what I really need is your vision. What's your vision about our mission? And he said, sorry, what do you mean? We've got our mission, vision and values. And she went, no. She went, Daniel, when you leave here in 5 or 10 or 15 years' time, how is this organisation in the world going to be different to what it was before you arrived? And there was a good pause, and he said, well, after the last 2 days, he said, it's going to have a hell of a lot more money. He says, once we've figured out how to do it. So there was probably, American organisations tend to be more vertical than European ones. There was probably 6 or 7 layers of management between that very sharp-witted young woman and the slightly more middle-aged Daniel Speckard. But it was a priceless transaction because what she was basically doing was challenging him to raise the bar for everybody. And because he was humble enough to say, I don't know how to do it, but I do know this is really, really important, that direct challenge, that led to a cascade of conversations over the next couple of hours that basically unblocked everything. So it's having the courage to take proposed solutions to your leadership rather than just telling them what's wrong.
Yeah. And it does link to another theme in the book, which is in these two businesses, often the internal business is less likely to be ambitious and to really dream very big, even if that could appear to be slightly irrational based on what we've achieved so far. I do find very often it is the fundraisers who are more likely to think that way and get frustrated that the other half is not. But again, I found reading the book helps me understand why this is. Yep. And it's not that the chief exec and or the other half of the organisation can't. It's just their existing parameters and culture and references are not to have done so far, but they're perfectly capable as long as there's a good dialogue and the question is asked.
Yeah, they are two completely different cultures. The businesses are not even a little bit different. They're diametrically different culturally. I mean, we don't have time to do a deep dive into the psychographics of the two businesses, fascinating though it is. That takes a whole day. But the very emotional makeup of the hive of each business is very, very different. The very best fundraisers are actually quite competitive people, and they don't always want to show that openly because competition is not always admired inside charities, but it's kind of useful if you're trying to raise a lot of money. The second thing is that the services department is often restrained in its ambition through coming from a culture of grant receiving. So the amount of money they can spend is limited because much of their spend is on grants. And a breakthrough moment is when people whose ambitions are restrained by the budget of a grant, they consider for the very first time ever going to fundraising and saying, I've got an idea of a new project. I can't think of a grant funder. Do you think you could raise money for it? I've heard so many stories about this. An organisation that ran a helpline for children. We managed to broker that discussion between the people who ran the programs and fundraising and said, come on, programs, have you helped every child in the world yet? And they went, no. And they said, well, come on, is there a project that you can't fund any other way that you could let fundraising loose on? And they went, no, not really. I said, come on, give us some ideas. What's the most important thing you'd like to do? And they said, well, at the moment, we can only open our helpline for 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. They said, but nobody will want to give money to that because it's just volunteers' expenses and equipment and telephone bill. And we stopped and had a think, and I talked to some of the fundraising team, and they went back, and one of the middle management fundraising people was briefed, and she said, could I reframe what we just said? And she said, what you said to me is that somewhere in our country there's a child who's terribly unhappy, who's been abused, and has been stuck in that situation for months, if not years. After months and years of torment, they have finally plucked up courage to get hold of a mobile phone, to hide in a cupboard under the stairs and dial your helpline and ask for help. And you don't answer because you don't have enough money. And the program's person went, it sounds different when you put it like that. Put it like that then. It took fundraising under a year to get the money to open the helpline 24/7.
Wow.
It was remarkable.
So when you put it like that, Alan, it's so clear that the second version is so much more compelling. And of course, there's people out there that would care to want to solve that problem and would care to donate. But I guess one question for me and maybe our listeners is, why is it so hard? Why doesn't every charity work more this way?
Fear of criticism. Fundraisers being scared of being criticised by services staff, being criticised by comm staff, fear of being criticised by the staff or by the media or by service users. Service departments' fear of being criticised by service users. Chief exec's fear of being criticised by everybody. It's fear of criticism. And that's when you end up with defensive communications that say, we're great, you can trust us, designed to overcome criticism. And it becomes particularly raw when you start to do fundraising properly, because a big part of being great at fundraising is you have to admit you're not good enough yet. If you had already solved the problem you exist to solve, you wouldn't need any more money. So you've got to be truthful and say, we're competent, we're good, we've got high quality services, but we haven't solved the problem yet, so we're not good enough yet, so we need more money. So actually, the very act of saying we have a need for more money is opening up a vulnerability, which some people perceive as a vulnerability to them being criticised. And if we look at the great fundraising organisations, what they've done is they've got over the endless seminars about how on earth can we have more money without either asking for it or being criticised. The two things every board dreams of. How can we have 10 times as much money without ever having to ask for it or ever being criticised? Well, you can't. Both are going to happen. And the great fundraising organisations leadership have accepted that the mission, the purpose, is more important than a few grumpy people criticising them, whether it's staff, whether it's donors, whether it's service users, whether it's the media. And they even accept that if you're going to do out in something special in this world, if you're going to do something exceptional in this world, and particularly with social media, you are going to be criticised. Everybody that does something, even if it's very good, will be criticised. So they don't put their energy into avoiding the criticism. They put their energy into how are we going to respond to it. Yeah. And I think I'll go back to RNLI again. I have never seen a better example in the whole of fundraising history than when RNLI reacted to being criticised for picking migrants out of the English Channel. You know, they were accused of being a taxi service for migrants. And what were they? An hour after that came out from those politicians, they put their mission, which is to save everyone, on the front page of their website. They put the migrant work and said, we do this, we're proud of it. If you disagree with us, we don't want you anyway. And they just absolutely no compromised on it. And they prepared for that because they knew their purpose, they were proud of it, they knew their behaviours. The laugh, of course, is they raised a huge amount of money by just sticking to their principles and saying, our job is to save everyone. It's not to save every British one or every white one, it's everyone. And if someone is drowning, we will go out and save them, never mind what you say. So thanks for your criticism, but we're going to carry on.
Love this story, Alan. not for the first time. You've put fire in my belly today with this conversation. I hope it will help our listeners as much as it's helped me, and we'll put details of how people can get hold of your book in our show notes. We'll put a link in there. Thank you ever so much for coming along and sharing these ideas, and for the years and years of slog and research and testing to create the book in the first place. I've really enjoyed it. I think it's going to help a lot of fundraisers and a lot of charities to make an even bigger difference. So thank you. And I look forward to catching up with you very soon.
Absolute pleasure. See you in real life very shortly. I can't wait for it, Rob.
Look forward to it. Thanks, Alan. Bye. Well, there you go. I hope you enjoyed Alan's ideas. As we always do, we'll put a summary in the episode notes on the podcast section of our Bright Spot website, including a link to Alan's book, Great Fundraising Organisations. If you've not already subscribed to this show, please do click that button now. You'll get instant access through your phone to dozens more strategies, examples and tips to help you with your fundraising. As I'm recording this, I need you to know that I am super excited about the batch of new Bright Spot stories I'm going to be sharing in the next few weeks. So please, don't miss out on the chance to receive those straight away when we release them. And if you find this podcast, my books, webinars, or our Breakfast Club helpful, and you're curious about the difference it would make if we went deeper and could help your whole team, then do get in touch to request a chat. If you work in high-value fundraising, our flagship programs, Major Gifts Mastery and Corporate Partnerships Mastery, will boost your confidence and help you raise more money. Or if you're the leader of a team, I'm incredibly proud of the difference our team training days make to a team's skills, energy levels, and proactivity. To find out more or request a chat, go to brightspotfundraising.co.uk/services. If you liked today's show and you think it would help other people, please do share it on with your colleagues and with other good causes through LinkedIn. I really do appreciate your help. Do let us know what you think. Alan and I are both on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for listening and supporting our show. Good luck with your fundraising, and I can't wait to share more encouraging stories with you very soon.